Welcome back, Mortgage Musketeers. Well, that happened. Long story, not worth going into. Today, though, we're going to be talking about seller concessions or seller contributions towards closing costs. All right, so what are we talking about when we say seller paid closing costs or seller concessions or seller contributions? It's all the same thing. So when you purchase a home, there's a certain percentage of your closing costs and prepaids that a seller can pay for. It depends on what kind of loan that you're having. So if you have a conventional loan, the maximum seller contributions is 3%. So if you had a $100,000 loan, the maximum they could contribute would be $3,000. If you had a government loan, whether it's FHA, USDA, or VA, the maximum that they can contribute is 6%. So on a $100,000 house, it'd be $6,000. So this is an important factor because if you don't have enough money to pay for your closing costs and prepaids, it is a way for you to get into a home. But there's a way and a methodology that you need to think about that. So I always use $100,000 as an easy demonstration, regardless of the home, because numbers are easier with $100,000. So look at it this way. Let's say that I was selling you a home for $100,000, and I needed to walk away from the closing table for exactly $100,000. But you need, say, $5,000 in closing costs and prepaids. So you can say, hey, Sean, I will buy your house for $100,000 if you pay $5,000 of my closing costs and prepaids. So normally just here say if you pay 5% of my closing costs. And if I say yes to that, then at the closing table, I'll get my $100,000 minus the $5,000 that I'm taking from my equity in the house to pay for your closing costs. Right? What the problem with that is then I walk away from the table at $95,000, and that won't work. So if you told me, Sean, I will pay you $105,000 for your house if you pay $5,000 of my closing costs, I would think, okay, because I need $100,000. You're essentially offering me $100,000, and then I'm going to pay 5% of your closing costs, or $5,000 of your closing costs. So $105,000 minus the $5,000 leaves me with the $100,000 that I need. So that's a very simplified version of that. Where it gets complicated is when you go into negotiations. Now, the realtors are all over this. This is their job. This is their wheelhouse. This is what they do. Normally what they do is they say, hey, Sean, how much do we need in seller contributions? Okay, or seller concessions. And then I have to work up the number depending on what kind of loan it is. And I say, hey, we need X amount so that all they have to do is bring their down payment. You cannot get around your down payment. All right? That is your skin in the game. You have to bring 3%, 3.5%, 5%, 20%, whatever the case may be. You have to bring the down payment, but you can have the sellers pay for the closing costs and prepaids. Now, depending on what state you get into, this can be pretty pricey. So in some states there are no transfer taxes. In other states there are transfer taxes. And the larger the sales price, the more your closing costs and prepaids are going to be. But of course, mathematically, the higher 3% would be, right? So if you're talking 3% of 200,000, you're talking $6,000 versus 3% of 100,000, where you're talking $3,000. So it does make a difference. So all these factors go in. Now, here's the important thing, and I'm going to tell you this two different ways because I've seen it kind of culturally, depending on where you live, as to how they negotiate the sales contract. So the example that I gave, we would think, okay, hey, we're going to negotiate $105,000. That's my offer. I'm going to offer $105,000 if you pay $5,000 of my closing costs. So I'm already thinking my sales price is $105,000, and it's going to be the seller paying $5,000 of my closing costs. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. I have seen it in some places in the country where they will negotiate the sales price, and then it confuses the seller a little, the buyer a little bit. So if we negotiate $100,000 and have the seller pay closing costs, in my mind, I'm thinking sales price is $100,000 and they're going to pay $5,000, therefore they're going to settle for 95. And that could work because maybe they only really needed 90 grand out of it. So based off of what I've offered $5,000 over 90, even though it's worth whatever, okay? That can work that way. But what I've seen in some places is they will negotiate the sales price and say, okay, the sales price is going to be $100,000. And then they write the contract for $105,000. I've seen it confuse the buyers, okay? So just make sure you clarify how that works, all right? And I don't think that way, but I've seen it on many contracts, and then I have to explain to the buyer why their sales price is higher than they expected. All right, so again, that's culturally just something to be aware of, but that's conceptually how it works. All right, so just understand that whatever the final sales price is going to be that minus the seller concessions. If where you live they can negotiate the sales price and then tack on the closing costs and prepaids after that, a little semantic difference, but imagine tacking on another $5,000, $10,000 to the sales price. It can take a buyer off where. So if you're a realtor watching this, keep that in mind, because I do run into it quite often, enough for me to mention it, obviously. All right, so that's basically how that works. We can delve into a little bit more in another video, but this gives you a heads up of how to deal with your closing costs and prepaids if you need the seller to pay for them. Beyond that, your realtor will know exactly how to explain the rest of it. All right, it was great seeing you again. Please hit the bell, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next time. It's all for one and one for all.